Howard. Okay. We're from Booming Acres. We are based out of Mundelein, up in the suburbs. We started off producing supplies for people to grow mushrooms, and we just started up a gourmet mushroom farm. So we grow like blue and pink oyster mushrooms, lion's mane, reishi, pioquinos, and then we still sell all the supplies for people to grow mushrooms as well. So if you're interested in getting more stuff later on, you can talk to us and check out our website. Today we're just going to do an overview of growing your own mushrooms at home. We'll talk about the various stages of growing mushrooms at home, kind of a brief overview of all of the different processes and stuff along the way. And then we've got little grow kits so that everybody can do some of the starting process. Take it home and grow some mushrooms of your own. If you have any questions along the way, we've got everything broken down into segments. So just wait till we get to the next segment. And if you have questions, raise your hand and we'll go over any questions. And then at the end, we'll do a full question and answer if there's any more questions that haven't been covered. And we'll do the hands-on demo towards the end as well. Yeah. All right. So yeah, these are the topics we're going to go over. I think I covered everything here. By the end of this, you should know the general concepts for growing mushrooms. You should be able to talk with your friends about how you know how to grow mushrooms. It's fairly easy. We won't do like super detailed stuff. You won't have a test or anything after this. So yeah. All right. So general concepts. Genetic material. There's a lot of different varieties and species of mushrooms. For the most part, genetic material is going to be spores. So most people should know mushrooms come from spores. The other types of genetic material would be liquid culture. Difference between the two is liquid culture is going to be the living tissue, the mycelium, suspended in a nutrient broth, and you can use that to grow mushrooms from. The mycelium will expand itself as you're growing. Basically, it skips a step that the spores do. Whenever spores connect, they germinate, and then they start to produce mycelium. That mycelium spreads out, eats the food, and later on produces the fruiting bodies. Using the liquid culture, you're skipping that first stage. So it's kind of like whenever you have a plant, you can start with a seed, or you can start with a cut. It's very similar in that regard. You're just skipping a step. You're jumping over one thing, it saves time. Doing that, you can also have clone material. So mushrooms, they have a lot of genetic traits and characteristics. Whenever you've got a lot of spores, it's kind of a hodgepodge of what genetics you're gonna, what features are gonna come from those genetics. And so to get a more even growth using a clone, you're gonna have more even distribution of the genetics. And so yeah, having the liquid culture, typically that's going to be mycelium that's been cloned from mushrooms. And so you're also having less genetic diversity in your growth, which is going to make it easier for you to grow as well. So spores, you get a little bit more diversity. It's a little bit harder to grow with. It takes a little bit more time. With liquid culture, there's less genetic diversity, and it's a little bit faster as well. Any questions between the two different types? All right. Want to go over sterility?
Sterility is important to grow because when you are growing mushrooms, you start with sterilized and pasteurized material. So anything that can be introduced into your grow will grow super rapidly. So if you're not sterile at the beginning, you can get stuff in there that will overtake the mushrooms that you're trying to grow, and it will kill off what is growing in there or try to fight. And it creates an environment that makes it harder for the stuff that you are growing to grow. So best way to stay sterile, just work your equipment that you're using. So anything metal you can heat up, get it red hot, should kill off everything. The surfaces we use
Yeah, so going off of what Joey was saying, mushrooms, they grow alongside other fungi. They grow alongside mold and bacteria. The environment that bacteria and that mold like, that's the environment that mushrooms like as well. So whenever you're working with something and you only want to grow what you want to grow, you have to avoid having any other kind of bacteria or molds present. So you want to have anything that you're working with sterile, because otherwise you're going to have other organisms growing alongside your mushrooms. So out in the wild, it's fine. Mushrooms will grow out in the wild just fine because they're used to having molds and other fungi and bacteria growing with them. Whenever you're growing mushrooms indoors, you don't want a bunch of mold and bacteria growing alongside stuff that you're planning on eating later, right? So even though out in the wild, that's fine and it can work, you don't want that in your house or in your grow area. You don't want it on the food that you're eating. So yeah, that's why sterility is really important. The environment and the food that you're going to introduce for your mushroom mycelium, it's the same food that bacteria and that other molds eat. So you have to start with nothing, only add what you want to grow, and then that way only what you want to grow is going to be there. Yeah, if you compromise the sterility, you're going to have molds and bacteria and whatnot growing, and a lot of the time when you're growing indoors, those molds and bacteria will take over because the mushrooms, their main line of defense is to kind of go into a hibernation state. They don't really have like an active immune system like we do. So they just kind of hunker down, they wait for the bacteria or the mold to eat everything that's around it, and then once they detect that there's nothing else growing around them, then we'll try to start growing out again. So it could take a long time for that to happen, and you have a bunch of moldy grain or something sitting around in the meantime, hanging out in the house. So any questions on sterility? We'll kind of go over like grain preparation, how to be sterile a little more later.
Can you do
Like a flow hood? Yeah, so if you want to work with like agar, or if you want to make your own liquid cultures, it is a good idea to have a flow hood. They are somewhat expensive, so a lot of people won't have a flow hood. You can work inside of a still air box, is what they call them. Basically, it's just a Rubbermaid tote, and you get all the air inside of that as clean as possible, and then you can kind of work in there, and you won't have to worry about all the air outside, moving around and whatnot, carrying spores and mold and whatnot with it. And so you can still do your clean work without having to have like the expensive flow hood equipment. Yeah, flow hoods, they're nice. It does make it a lot easier to grow with, but it's not a requirement. Any other questions on being sterile? All right.
Okay. You said you were going to talk about preparing your grain spawn and everything next week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go over
sterilizing your medium for that, because I was going to ask.
Yeah, we'll go over sterilization and how for mycology to sterilize grain and whatnot. Yeah, we'll go over that. I'll go over environmental conditions.
Sure. So for the environments for mushrooms, a lot of ones that we grow, like high humidity environments. So we'll use a humidifier and pump through the temp. And then alongside that, we have fans that push the air out, or suck the air out, I'm sorry. So every now and then, the air is completely changed, and the CO2 levels rise too high and or get too low. Mushrooms breathe CO2, I believe, and they put it out. They take in CO2.
Yeah.
They put it out.
Yeah.
So it just helps to have everything equal and push the way. So.
Yeah. So like Joe was saying, high humidity is important for mushrooms. Whenever you go looking for mushrooms out in the forest, it's a good idea to go after grain in areas with high humidity. The air conditions are important. Mushrooms breathe out CO2 and in oxygen the same way that humans do. So whenever you're growing, if you're doing like a kit at home, you kind of have to keep in mind your CO2 levels. They do like some fresh air, so you got to give them oxygen. Having too much CO2, you'll get weird mushrooms or temperature is also kind of important. Mushrooms typically like it a little bit cooler. A lot of the gourmet mushrooms, like the mushrooms that we're going to have in the grow kits today, they do prefer a cooler environment. Usually low 70s, high 60s is pretty good for them. If you go down south, you'll find more mushrooms that grow in higher temperatures. So down in Florida, there's mushrooms that grow still, even if it's 80, 90 degrees. Basically anywhere 65 and higher, you'll find mushrooms as long as it's humid out. Any questions on like environmental stuff and growing mushrooms at home? We'll kind of go over a little bit more like the exact conditions for growing at home for like grow kits and whatnot a little bit later. Alright. For harvesting, what you do with mushrooms afterwards, basically it's up to you. The ones that we'll give you guys, once you get to your harvest, you'll be able to eat them. I think most people did either blue or pink oyster. Those are really good. Just slice them up, put them in some butter and garlic. You can use them in soups. You can also dry them. You don't want to eat them right away. Dry them out and then add them to like a soup stock later. That works too. Typically, you'll want to harvest your mushrooms before they put out a lot of spores. Whenever your mushrooms are producing a lot of spores, the spores can add kind of a different flavor to them. And as the mushrooms start to focus on producing spores, they lose a lot of their the flavor to them. So we'll go over when we're doing the kits the exact time when you would be harvesting those mushrooms. The other kits that we have are for reishi mushrooms. Those are ready to harvest once they get, they'll grow kind of like antlers, they'll grow kind of like sticks, and the whole stick will have kind of a, like an orange brown around it. Once the top of that turns orangish brownish, that's when you'll harvest that. Reishis, you won't eat those. Those ones, they're kind of like woody, they're really tough. You'll use those for making tea. You would dehydrate it or put it into a tea bag right away and add it to tea. Dehydrate it, break it up, put it into tea bags, and make tea with it for that. We'll go over a little bit more with harvesting. Alright, so general supplies, we kind of already went over genetic material. Booming acres, we've got genetic material. There's a bunch of vendors online for genetic material for spores and liquid culture. You always start with some sort of genetic material. You have to start from somewhere, and that's how mushroom starts, spores or liquid culture. You can also find agar plates that people sell that have mycelium on them, and it's the same concept. The mycelium will expand to the grain, and it'll colonize the same way. It's just a little bit more hands-on. You would need to have the flow hood like we were talking about earlier, since the agar is a little more susceptible to contamination. So that'd be like a mushroom 102, 103 kind of work. So we won't talk too much about agar. The other thing for growing at home, a lot of the time it's good to have like a plastic tote bin, just to have a specific environment to grow in. Even if you're growing with these grow kits, it's a good idea to have it open just so that you can control the environment a little bit better. You can control the temperature that's inside, and you can control the humidity as well a little bit easier than if you just have it sitting like in a closet or out on your desk or something like that. It's a little easier to control just a little box rather than the whole room being humid. That kind of goes in with the growing areas thing. You want an area that you can control the temperature, the humidity, and the lighting. Mushrooms typically prefer to be dark. They grow, in the soil or inside of trees. So you want to kind of mimic that with your grow area. So it's a good idea to have somewhere that is dark. And you want to have it between, whenever mushrooms are colonizing, you typically want them to be warm. So all the mushrooms that we have today, they colonize in warm environments, so around room temperature is good. If you're comfortable, the mushrooms will grow well. So low 70s to mid 70s, 75 is kind of ideal. Nothing above 75, really. 72 is what I always recommend for people. Yeah, so you can have a tent if you would want to. If you want to really get into growing mushrooms, it's not required. They do sell, they're called Martha tents. They're just big tents. They're usually clear. They have shelves built inside of them. You can have one of those and hook up a humidifier to that, and then you can have all your projects growing in there. They're nice if you have the space. If you don't have the space, a little open works really well. It costs, a fraction of the price of having a whole tent. Fans are only required if you're doing like a big tent, as long as you give your project some air, to get rid of the CO2, to add oxygen. You don't really need a fan unless you have a big tent going. For us, like Joey was saying, we have really big fans that pull all the air out, which pulls in fresh air, so it keeps our CO2 levels where we need them. But unless you're growing, 10, 20, 30 pounds of mushrooms a week, that won't be required for a hobby grower. Lighting. Oh, sorry.
How do you keep it humid? So is it just boiling water under the tote bin or?
Yeah, so if you're growing in a tote bin, you can take these blocks and you would put it inside of the bin. The bags that we provide, and a lot of the bags that people make, they hold their own humidity inside of them. If you spawn the block inside after it's colonized, you can have some moist perlite down at the bottom, and that'll keep the humidity high inside of the tote bin. The other option would be to hook up a humidifier. You wouldn't really want to have just like a bowl sitting in it, because you'll grow like bacteria and stuff in it, some algae. So so hook up a humidifier to it, or you would use a bag so that the environment inside is contained, because it'll already have water inside of it, which we'll go over kind of on the next point with grains and substrates.
I don't know if you guys have tried this, but I have heard of some other recommendations for people growing in tents, or if they're growing straight from the container, to put like the tent pads in their tent, like the diapers, and you can just wet them a little, and then the water or the air will pull out the humidity in those pads.
I just heard about people doing that recently.
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't buy diapers. I would buy pet potty pads. I hadn't even thought about doing that, and then someone sent us an email not long ago, and they were like, I don't want to buy perlite, so I just got like a potty pad for dogs, It's like, that's actually really smart. Perlite is kind of a pain to get, and it's kind of messy. But you can just use a doggy pad or a diaper, and it'll just work the humidity into the air. Good question. All right, so the next thing, grains. So basically all mushrooms that people grow other than cordyceps, which we'll talk about last, start off on grain. So mushroom mycelium really likes sugar, and it likes the general nutritional profile that grain offers. So that's why we grow on cereal grains. So corn, rye, oats, milo, millet. You could grow on quinoa. You can grow on rice. Basically, any grain is going to be good. You don't want to go to the store and get like oatmeal. You have to get whole oats. That's the main thing that you got to look for is whole grains. You can't use like milled grain. Or you could use milled grains, but it's a lot easier to use whole grains.
So if you start with mushrooms in grains that include wheat, is there a problem for those mushrooms for something that's celiac?
Yes. So if your grains contain gluten,
They do absorb from the grain.
Yeah, they will absorb it. I'm not 100% on the rates that it does, that they absorb, but it does transfer the gluten over. So what you can do is avoid growing on grains that have gluten in them. So our products that we have, they don't contain gluten. So it's oats and milo, and those grains don't have gluten in them. So our bags are good. So if anybody here is sensitive to gluten, you don't have to worry about that. Rye has gluten in it, so if you have celiac or sensitivity to gluten, you would avoid rye. they get into the mushrooms. But yeah, so you start with cereal grains. Basically, the steps with preparing your grain is hydrating the grain. You'll do that either by soaking overnight for 24 hours or boiling your grain. Like I said, we're just doing like a basic crash course. You would need to look up like an exact guide with times and everything for this, but basically you're going to heat up the grain in water so that it starts to absorb the moisture. That moisture is what the mycelium uses along with the sugars that are in the grain to spread out. So it eats the grain, uses the water, and spreads out. As it spreads out, it eats more of the grain, gets more carbohydrates, more of the nutrients, and it keeps on spreading and spreading. Eventually it eats everything that's available, and then once there's no food left, the mycelium says, all right, is the environment good for me to start fruiting? Is there any food left? If everything's good, it wants to fruit, it wants to reproduce. So mushrooms are the fruiting body, or the reproductive organ for mycelium. So when there's no food left and the environment's right, it'll start to grow mushrooms. And then the mushrooms produce spores, the spores would go out, repeat the process. So that's what grains are for. So you get all the foods so that the mycelium can spread and then produce the fruiting bodies. Any questions on the brief overview of grains? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, just kind of a follow-up to the gluten question. So do you use organic grains? Because other grains, they have trace amounts of like herbicides, fungicides, pesticides. Could those potentially be concentrated in the mushroom if it's pulling out all the stuff out of the grains?
So our grains aren't labeled as organic. We do get them from a large grain manufacturer. The prices for organic grains is like almost 3 times as much. But whenever you're producing grains, you're going to be using a lot of water to produce them. So you're boiling the grains, you rinse them off. So any pesticides or anything that aren't like uptaken by the grain, anything that's sprayed on them would be rinsed off. And then whenever you process the grain, you'd also break down any chemicals that are left behind with the high heat that you use for sterilizing the grain, which I'll talk about in a moment here. Yeah, unfortunately, we run into issues where we can't source grain sometimes, and if we were getting organic grain, it would be like a huge impact on the grain industry. It would drive up the prices of how much we buy, and our stuff would be crazy expensive then. So, yeah, for the most part, we try not to take people's food, so it kind of works out for us that we don't have to source organic grain. It'd be nice if we could, but our grains aren't GMO, so that's one nice thing with them, is that they're certified non-GMO. But yeah, with how much grain there is, they gotta use pesticides and stuff to do it. So,
do you ever supplement your grains with anything else in the mix, like an additional nitrogen source, or do you need any different additions of nutrients, or is it sufficient to just have the grain?
Yeah, so for the most part, just the grain is good. The next thing that we'll talk about is substrate, and substrate can have more nutrients to it. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the different types of substrates as well. Grain itself, it is, a whole food, so there's not a whole lot that you can add to it. And mushrooms are water. They're mostly water. They're 90% water by weight. So there's not a lot of nutritional content to mushrooms, so they're not going to uptake a lot of nutrition from the grain. It's mostly the carbohydrates that they want. So there's some recipes online where people will add extra sugar. So they'll add honey, or they'll add corn syrup to it, and that'll help speed up the growth a little bit. But for the most part, you wouldn't need to add any additional iron or magnesium, nitrogen, anything like that. Yeah, so once you have your grain hydrated, the next part is sterilizing it. So like we said earlier, you want to kill off anything that's not, you want to kill off everything. So you sterilize the grain, so you put your grain into either jars or bags. You have to have bags that are specifically made for processing grains because it goes into high heat, typically at home, if you're producing your own grain, you would use a pressure cooker to get really hot. You want to aim for 250 degrees. That's the standard temperature for processing grains. You get your grain up to 250 degrees, you hold it at that temperature for about 30 minutes, and once it comes out, everything that was inside of that grain or inside of that jar or bag, it's all dead. So the only thing that's in there is just grain, which is just nutrients and water. So nothing's going to grow in there, it's sterile. Once it's cooled off and everything, then you would add your spores or your liquid culture to it. And then the only thing that's alive in that grain is the mushroom mycelium or the spores. Then it eats up the grain, and the only thing you add is colonized grain. So again, if you want to process your own grain, you look up a guide online, and there's plenty of them out there. But the main thing is hydrate it, then you sterilize it, let it cool off, and then you inoculate it. And we'll go over inoculating whenever we're doing the hands-on part of the presentation. Any question on grains? Simple overview of production. All right. Want to talk a little bit about the substrate?
Sure. You can use a variety of substrates. For the ones that we make, we use coconut core, and in that coconut core we mix in 2 grades of vermiculite called cold water. We will also add azimate to it, which I believe adds nitrogen, which is supposed to mimic what we find in dung or something similar. The substrate is then hydrated and mixed up, and we bag it up, and we'll pasteurize it using pressure and heat. It's a lower temperature and time than what we use for the grains, because the grains need to be actually sterilized. For the substrate, it's just pasteurization, so it would be a lower temperature, lower time. We'll pull them out, and it'll be the same deal where it's a more sterile environment in there than it was when we left. So that you can introduce your inoculated grains to it, mix them up, and have a working product.
Yeah, so that's the basis for substrates. The main substrate varieties that mushrooms like, there's 2 main ones, and then we'll talk about the cordyceps size. There's wood-loving mushrooms, and then there's dung or manure-loving mushrooms. Wood-loving mushrooms, all the mushrooms that we have for you guys and all the mushrooms that we grow at our facility are wood-loving mushrooms, so they grow on trees, typically dead trees. They use the lignin that's in the trees for energy. They break it down into carbohydrates. They use that for energy. The other ones are dung or manure-loving mushrooms. They use the nitrogen and the mineral content from manure to grow the mycelium and then put out the fruiting bodies. Jordan mentioned azimite. That's what we add for our substrate, where it adds a little bit of those that extra nutrition to the substrate. So it does add some of the minerals that will be missing for whenever you want to grow dung or manure-loving mushrooms. So yeah, a little bit of nitrogen, iron, magnesium, I think. Yeah, it's volcanic ash is what azimite is. Some people add gypsum to their substrate as well. It's got a little bit of calcium in it. So yeah, that's the little bit of extra nutritional value that you can add to your substrate. And then going off what Joey was saying about the different temperatures for making substrate. Substrate doesn't have a lot of nutrition in it, and it doesn't have any carbohydrates in it. So you don't have to get it as high of a temperature because there's not as many organisms in it to kill off. They're not able to break down the lignin into carbohydrates. There's no carbohydrates in wood to begin with, so you don't have to worry as much about mold and other fungi coming in and eating it. So, yeah, there's a little bit less temperature involved there. It doesn't have to be sterilized, it just has to be pasteurized. So that's the difference between pasteurization and sterilization is pasteurization leaves behind organisms, and sterilization, everything's dead. Yeah, like I said, all of the bags that we have today, these are all wood-loving bags. So all these mushrooms are wood-loving mushrooms. The last one, cordyceps, those, I forget the term for it, but they grow on
cordyceps are the mushrooms from that TV show, The Last of Us, I think it was, where they take over people's brains. The ones that actually exist, I know there's some for like caterpillars, butterflies, moths, ants. They get into the insect's brains, and eventually they eat the insect from the inside out, and then the brooding body comes out, produces spores, infects the rest of the colony. Those ones, the substrate that they like is protein. They break down protein for energy. So, if you want to grow those at home, you got to look at the guide for those. We don't want to touch on those too much. It's a little bit more complicated. I think that most of the time for home growers, you would buy powdered insects or eggs. You can use eggs. So, any questions on substrate? Differences between the substrates? All right. Cleaning products. That's the other thing that you'll need. Jody earlier mentioned with quat sanitizer. It's an ammonia-based cleaner. Usually they use it for cleaning kitchens. The other one that you can find that's really easy is either bleach or rubbing alcohol, isopropyl alcohol. Both of those work fine. If you're using bleach, just wipe it down with water afterwards. It's residual stuff. But yeah, being clean, that's the main thing for the cleaning stuff. Don't go overboard. There's things that will go over with the kits that you don't want to touch with cleaning products because it can mess things up. But yeah, just use typical standard household stuff. Any questions? Alright. Alright, we'll do a quick thing on the different stages for growing preparation. We kind of went over that already. Inoculation, that's whenever you are injecting or adding your genetic material, your spores or liquid culture, to the grain, or the liquid culture whenever you're making liquid culture or agar. So inoculation is basically adding your genetic material to your growing material. Today we'll be inoculating using syringes with liquid culture inside.
So why is it called inoculation? I usually think inoculation is sensitive.
I think that it kind of goes alongside with using a syringe. So it's inoculating, you're adding material to something. Yeah, I think that both of them are kind of the same thing, just different utilization. All right, colonization, that's the next step. That's whenever your mycelium is spreading. So in these, I'll finally show you guys one of the kits. These are the kits. Colonization is you don't see anything growing in here right now. Colonizing is when the mycelium is growing in the bag. So it'll start off by eating this grain layer, and then you'll mix it up. We'll go over this one. You'll mix it up, and it'll colonize the substrate. Once the colonization has happened, that's when you would do spawning. Spawning is whenever you present your material to when you present your material for fruiting. So you can spawn your grain to substrate, or you can spawn your colonized material to the outside environment, and then fruits come from there. For these projects, like I said, you would colonize the bottom grain layer, and then you would kind of spawn it by mixing up your bag, let it colonize again, and then you would spawn it by introducing the fruiting conditions. We'll go over that. Harvesting, that's kind of the last thing that you do with these. That's when your mushrooms are matured. You pull the mushrooms off, and then you do whatever you want to do with them. And that's the whole process is part. Any questions on the brief stages of everything? All right. Okay.
Our mushrooms in our tent are usually top fruiters, so for harvesting, it's just twisting the mushrooms off and using them to sterilize the fruits off. So it's a very simple process.
Yeah. All right. So we'll do the how-to now. Does everybody want to come over here? We'll do a demo. We'll show everybody